It's time for Ladies Can We Talk on 660 AM The Answer. Common sense talk with women and men about politics and standing up for America. With your host, nationally acclaimed speaker and author, Debbie Georgatos. Ladies Can We Talk starts now.
Good evening and welcome to Ladies Can We Talk. Thank you so very much for tuning in to Ladies Can We Talk, where all issues are women's issues and we talk truth about America. My name is Debbie Georgatos. I'm the host of this show. I'm also the author of the book, Ladies Can We Talk. And this show is once a week for 2 hours on Sunday evenings. And the hardest part of my planning for the show is choosing among the many stories that are making news in the world and in America, which stories to talk about on the show each evening, each Sunday. And I like to remind our listeners that this show is always about understanding and then therefore preserving the greatness, the uniqueness, the exceptionalness of America. And we try each week to talk about the stories in the news from the perspective, how do we make sure that in generations to come, America is still great as it is now? Well, tonight's show is just packed, and I will tell you a quick run through what we're going to be talking about tonight. We have two guests who will be joining us, both calling in for their interviews. One is Pastor Stephen Broden. He was a former candidate for United States Congress in the Texas Congressional District 30. He's an African-American pastor. He's also as a conservative advocate, and he's going to talk about an idea he has for people in Texas and around the country to stand up in favor of their religious rights, given the things coming out of the Supreme Court. And I will talk to him in just 15 minutes at 6:15. In the top of the second hour, we have a woman calling in named Emily Kibideau. I met her recently. She is the in-house counsel for Texas Right to Life and also their political director. And she's young and smart and savvy and fun to talk to. And just going to talk with her about what do the Right to Life people want in Texas now that we really had much of legislation that the Right to Life groups supported. Now that it's passed, what is it they're looking for? So she's just great to talk with. Can't wait to have her on. And then my guests, or my leading ladies the second hour tonight are Carrie Kellerman and Chris Davis. We always have our second hour. We try to make it more of a sitting around having coffee around the table and just talking about America. And so they'll join me shortly. But what I try to do in this first segment and what I want to turn to right now, actually, a quick run through the things we want to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk with you about this Kentucky County Clerk, Kim Davis, who is in jail this weekend because of her refusal to issue licenses to get married to same-sex couples. I'm going to talk about her and religious freedom and how all that works out in America. I feel like I'm harking back to my law school days. I'm looking a lot more than I have in a long time at the Constitution and case law, just trying to understand how do we solve some of these problems America faces. But we'll talk about that case. We're going to talk about Labor Day and labor unions. That was my area of law. I did labor and employment litigation in California. And I want to talk a little bit about Labor Day because it is Labor Day weekend. I want to talk, of course, about Officer Goforth, the Texas deputy who was gunned down randomly by a complete stranger and all of the heartbreak around that, but also the questions it raises about how we address race relations in America, how we solve race relations. We're going to talk about that story. We're also going to touch a little bit in the second hour on some new cases that have come out involving young people and in the transgender issue. And I'll just leave it at that. There are a lot of things I want to talk about that really tie into America. I want to tell you about the movie War Room. If you haven't seen it, it's phenomenal. And we're, of course, going to wrap up with presidential run-through, the latest on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Carly Fiorina, Ted Cruz. We're going to talk about the presidential race. But in this Speak Up for America segment, I want to ask you to focus a little bit on this decision that a woman who is a clerk in Kentucky, her job description as an employee of the state is to issue marriage licenses. And in the United States Supreme Court decided, as I'm sure everyone listening to the show knows, the United States Supreme Court decided fairly recently that all states must honor same-sex marriage. They essentially legitimize same-sex marriage in every state, or they tried to. That's what the Supreme Court did. In a 5-4 decision, 9 justices, 5-4. So Obergefell versus Hodges was the name of the case. And I want to talk about this woman who is essentially saying that her faith, her Christian faith, instructs her that she cannot condone or participate or issue a marriage license to a same-sex couple. And, I have to say, it's I think this issue is much more profound than it may appear on the surface. On the one hand, you can say we're a nation of laws. We have a rule of law. The rule of law says the Supreme Court is the final arbiter. The United States Supreme Court, they issued a ruling. They said same-sex marriage goes. Everyone must honor it. Every state must honor it. And so that decision is what is compelling in fact, what's happened to this woman who's a clerk because she wouldn't issue the decision, she's actually in jail this weekend. And she's, as she says, she's in solitary, or she's by herself. She's got her Bible and she's going to stay there. She's not going to give in and issue same-sex marriage licenses. And she has a religious freedom argument. It's not just a personal preference. It's in the core of her Christian belief. She happens, by the way, to be a Democrat. I think it's a good point to make for people who think this is a Republican versus Democrat issue, because it's really not. It goes far deeper into what our civilization, our American civilization, our American society and culture, what it's based on. So she's in jail. The court has found she simply must honor. She doesn't have a right to decline to issue this marriage licenses to same-sex couples. But I want to ask you to step back and just consider a few things. The United States Supreme Court issued that decision in the context of many, many, many states having had the issue put on their ballot. States around the country had voters actually going to the polls to decide whether or not to support same-sex marriage. I'm going to tell you that 31 states who considered the issue, 31 states, the majority voted for traditional marriage only. In fact, 41 million Americans have voted yes on traditional marriage only. Only 3.3 million Americans have voted yes on same-sex marriage. So the American, despite the polls that are very contorted, not going to talk about those tonight, but many polls try to portray the idea that people think same-sex marriage is okay, and you have to look really closely what was asked when they, so you know what the people were really answering. But when people had a chance to vote on it, only 3 states. In only 3 states, in all 50, not 57, 50 states, only 3 voted yes for same-sex marriage. And those states were Maine, Maryland, and Washington, the state of Washington. And the reason it's relevant is we have to have a rule of law, but ultimately, a higher law is what founded America. The recognition, back at the time of the founding of America, it was civil disobedience, at least, for the founders to say, we are not going to follow King George's edicts. We are not going to submit to his unreasonable, irrational rulings. We are going to stand up for liberty. So this concept of civil disobedience, I remember talking about that. In fact, it was a big discussion. I went to Georgetown Law School, and so there were just kind of regular sorts of discussions. There were protests going on all the time. So you'd be aware of these things. There was a lot of discussion in law school about civil disobedience. And one of the basic points was, if you find a law is morally abhorrent to you, you can stand up. But one of the tenets of civil disobedience is you have to accept the consequence, which this woman is doing. She's not hiding. She's saying, okay, I feel so strongly about this that I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say no. And if I have to go to jail, I will. And I ask you all to consider this idea. In America, we do have to have rule of law, but we are still a majority Christian nation. And Christianity and Judaism for 2,000 plus years has embraced and supported and recognized as an important central tenet that marriage is a relationship between a man and a woman. It is the cultural building block of America. It is not just a whim of a minority. It is the cultural building block of our country. And so to have essentially 5 judges sitting up in Washington who lucked out and got the Senate to approve their nomination to serve in the Supreme Court, to have those 5 judges say, we are going to substitute our judgment for every single belief in the Jewish faith, in the Christian faith, in the Bible. We're going to say we know better. This was a monumental decision against the will of the American people. The vast majority of the American people, given a chance to vote, support and vote for only traditional marriage. What the Supreme Court said is, we get to decide, not your faith, not what you think is true, but what we decide is true. We are the arbiters of truth. We know better than the Bible. We know better than the teachers, the pastors, the priests, the rabbis. We know better than all of them. We get to say, and we're going to overrule everyone who doesn't agree with us. This was a major inroad into destroying the kind of cultural fabric of America. And so, back to our friend in Kentucky, I don't know this woman, but she's being very brave. But ultimately, we have to come as a society to a better answer than just simply she has to stay in jail and same-sex marriage can go on when most Americans didn't support that. So there are options being presented by some of our presidential candidates. How do you get around this? What do you do in the Supreme Court is, in my view, issuing rogue, lawless, decisions with no merit, no justification. They had no right to change marriage. They simply didn't have that right. And so one of the ideas is, well, we have to look toward a constitutional amendment. We have to say, we're going to push forward a constitutional amendment saying marriage is one man and one woman. That's one idea. Another that's been floated by many people who are supporting having a Convention of the States pushing constitutional amendment via the vehicle of Convention of the States, is to say we're going to have an amendment, we're going to push an amendment forward that says that a supermajority of the American people or a supermajority of Congress, some body can be empowered in our country to overrule the Supreme Court. That Supreme Court just it's 9 people, and in this case, 5 people, who have overwhelmed the will of the American people. And, when you first read these ideas, you think, wow, that'd be such a huge change. In our country, we've had the Supreme Court. They've always been the final arbiter. We're really unsettling that. Yes, it would be really unsettling, but the other choice is to continue to allow what, in this particular case, is simply tyranny. It's the Supreme Court saying, we are going to overrule religious faith. We're going to overrule what many Americans have believed and what churches have taught for centuries, because we kind of think, in fact, there's language in the ruling that makes it clear. Some of the judges actually looked at American culture as a guideline as to whether or not how they should rule. Well, we think people are kind of ready for same-sex marriage. This is not the role the Supreme Court has. So back to this is my Speak Up for America segment. Every week I do this. Speaking up for America has to include speaking up for the cultural fabric of America and not allowing it to be destroyed by a rogue Supreme Court issuing rulings that undermine some of the most basic teachings of Christianity and Judaism for 2,000 plus years. So we're going to talk in the next segment. We have a caller calling in the next segment, Pastor Stephen Broden. He's, as I said before, a pastor in this area. He also has an idea of how to handle this Supreme Court. One step that could be made by voters to try to send a signal to the Supreme Court and to the federal government that we in Texas are going to comply with our Constitution, which calls marriage a relationship between one man and one woman. So this is Debbie Georgatos, and Ladies, Can We Talk? Come on back after our break. We'll talk with Pastor Stephen Broden about his idea how to speak back against a lawless Supreme Court. Debbie Georgatos, 660 AM, The Answer. Come on back after our break.